Today, on Here is the Horror.
Do you know what the most frightening thing in the world is? It's fear.
Hello, and welcome to Here is the Horror, our second episode, The Beginnings of Horror. I'm Adam, and I'm co-hosting here with my friend Daniel.
Hello.
And I can say, after our first episode, I don't know about you, but I have a couple of regrets from it. I regret not really planning out a little bit more how the structure for it was going to be. I regret not mentioning a couple of things in my intro section, like the Monsters TV show, or Atmosphere board game, or Carnival of Souls.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Or even like early NES games I was super into, like Castlevania 1, Friday the 13th. But most of all, I regret not realizing how long it was going to take to edit 2.5 hours of audio.
From two different sources.
Yeah. Well, that part wasn't too bad, but I was up till 7 a.m. last night doing that, so that's the true horror.
And I'm eternally grateful.
I did happen to look into, since you were talking about Zeke the Plumber last time from Salute Your Shorts, I looked into it and saw that that episode was written by Steve Slavkin, who was the creator of the show and writer for most of the episodes, and voiced Dr. Khan, the camp owner you always hear over the loudspeakers.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, he does not work any on Are You Afraid of the Dark, just some teen sitcoms I'd never heard of, and a little bit of Power Rangers.
I wonder if he also wrote the episode about the cursed skull.
Well, he wrote the majority of the episodes, so it's likely. That said, I had hoped to have a lot new horror read for this episode. I have a big stack of books behind me, but it turns out all the editing and getting everything set up takes way longer than I anticipated, so I have read almost nothing since the last episode. I made it a very small portion into Matthew Lewis's The Monk, but not enough to matter. But we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I'll just have to go off other people's impressions for now, I guess. That said, though, I did mention to a friend of mine from work that we were doing this show, and he told me I should watch Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, which, while I was editing last episode, I realized that you actually mentioned it during it. I actually hadn't heard of it. So apparently you've seen this movie before.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Okay, well, I love it too, yeah. It was a very pleasant surprise. For anyone that doesn't know, it's Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. It's a 2006 film by Glen Echo Entertainment, distributed by Anchor Bay, written by Scott Glosserman and David J. Steve, directed and produced by Scott Glosserman also. And yeah, that was a really pleasant surprise. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't a mockumentary about how slashers prepare to become slashers.
Yeah, and I like the behind the curtains aspect where it kind of tries to explain Michael and Freddy and how they create their mythology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it had a lot of Easter eggs too. I mean, like
Robert Englund.
Yeah, he's playing sort of a Dr. Loomis role. And then it's got some nice switch-arounds of its references. Like it has a moment where they're filming a few seconds on Elm Street talking about these other horror franchises like they really happened. And they've got Kane Hodder living on Elm Street.
And Zelda Rubinstein.
Oh, yeah. That was
Pangea.
I think the moment I started to get excited is when I was looking up the credits of who was in it and I saw her name pop up. And Robert Englund's, of course.
I think of that movie is kind of like the proto Cabin in the Woods.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I was sort of thinking of it as a successor to Scream. Since there's the Scream remake in the works now, I was actually speaking with that same friend at work about how, the original Scream is sort of like a deconstruction of what the slasher genres had become. It was a way to try to freshen them up after they'd become too tropey. So once you're on Scream 5, though, you're kind of your own trope. Admittedly, I haven't seen Scream 4, and I think I've only seen 3 once, and I don't remember it that well. I remember most of the gas of what that idea was being spent on the first one. I did think, though, it would be interesting if instead of Scream becoming its own franchise that just recycles its own tropes, it would be interesting if it just continued to be a deconstruction of the horror genre as it exists today. So, for example, when Scream 3 or 4 came out, it could have been a criticism of the torture porn genre that was big at the time, like Saw and Hostel. And if you did a Scream 5 now, it could be more about all the found footage things that are going on now, and in that way you could sort of keep the concept fresh, but
Yeah, I mean, as the franchise went on, I mean, it gets harder and harder to kind of move away from the tropes, or when your franchise is based on going against expectations, that in itself becomes a trope.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking of when I saw The Rise of Leslie Vernon, because that sort of mockumentary way that they shot it made me think this is what a modern Scream is, basically. You know, sort of taking the things that we're doing in horror movies now and then reapplying them in a sort of self-referential, tongue-in-cheek way. Besides that, just a funny movie. That did remind me I had one other regret from last episode, which was that I felt like we didn't really decide how we were going to address spoilers in any capacity. I think I just sort of, in my mind, decided that anything that felt sufficiently old I would spoiler freely, but if it was within the last year or two, then I would elect not to.
Generally, if it's something that, you know, I think is maybe underrated or has a bit more of a cult status, I would personally try to avoid spoilers, because there will be people that haven't been exposed to it before, and their initial, you know, learning of the subject will be, you know, hearing us talk about it. And, you know, one can hope anyways.
Yeah, so I doubt we'll be perfect about it, but I guess I'll try to keep in mind to mention if I think we're going to be going into spoiler territory on our discussion on anything, but I guess unless we say it, I'll try to avoid it. That said, so I saw The Mask 2006. I felt like I should see something modern. I want to try to make sure I watch something relatively new each time we do an episode. So I just went ahead and went with what the latest thing on Shudder was, which was The Shed, which looks like it was film festivals in 2019, but it's on Shudder now. It's a Bigger Boats production, written and directed by Frank Sabatella, produced by Peter Block and Corey Neal. Have you seen that one?
It's on my backlog. I actually picked that up now. It's on Shudder for free, but I actually picked it up a while back. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet. It looks interesting.
It's a good time for me to practice not giving out spoilers then, I guess. So I will say I did enjoy it. I read a couple different reviews from people both liking and disliking it, and it seemed like the people that disliked it did so because they felt it was too tropey, and the people that liked it just liked it because it was tropey. It is very much, you know, the high school rejects down on their luck getting bullied, and then a supernatural element comes in and sort of creates a situation where they can sort of be the hero. I will say, hopefully you don't consider this a spoiler, I went in kind of expecting it to be kind of an art housey film where I don't know what I was imagining, like the kid would be like sitting outside the shed during the daytime telling his problems to this vampire that's trapped in the shed, and it would represent his inner troubles, but no, there's none of that. It's just a monster, and it stays a monster.
You know, I will say when I initially learned of it, I went and watched some trailers, read some stuff on it. It kept striking me as I got this very Fright Night remake vibe from it.
Oh yeah, I saw some other people say that too, and I definitely agree with that. There's definitely Fright Night vibes, even in like the main character and his kind of like weirder, more unhinged friend. That's the way the main character and his best friend are.
Well, it worked in Dead Girl.
I missed it because it wasn't listed somewhere, but well, it's written and directed by Frank Sabatella. The story says it's by Jason Rice. Also, the music, I liked the music in a lot, both the scoring and just all the incidental songs in it. I think it said the music was by Sam Ewing, who apparently did music for the TV shows for Damien, Constantine, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and The Walking Dead, along with other people on all those, of course. And it has scores done by Bear McCreary, who seems like he's all over the place now. I know he did music for the most recent God of War. I think he got his start in fame doing the soundtrack for Battlestar Galactica, but it seems like he's just in everything these days. I know he's doing music for that new Ashes of Creation MMO. But anyways, yes, I was really worried that The Shed was going to be just not much horror at all, and it was just going to be a lot more focused on just teen drama. But no, it's a horror movie. Fright Night is definitely on point with the sort of vibe that it ends up having, and I enjoyed it. Alright, so those are the only two movies I've unfortunately had time to watch since last week. How about you? You watched anything?
I recently watched Haunt. It's distributed by Momentum Pictures. It was written by Scott Beck and Brian Woods. It was directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, and it was produced by Todd Garner, Mark Fasano, Vishal Rungta, and Eli Roth. So you see that name, you know that he's a divisive presence in the genre. I've read reviews of anything he's involved with in any capacity. I've read reviews where people treat him like he's Michael Bay, and I've read reviews where people treat him like he's Stanley Kubrick. I like a lot of the stuff he's been involved with. It's definitely a slasher. These people, they end up with an invite to this kind of like haunted house. It's a group of friends, and it hits all the notes. They introduce themselves, to the audience. They're friends. They're in a group. Goes through, the typical, these two are together. These two have a history. Well, when they get to this haunted house, it starts off kind of innocently enough, and then things escalate. And from there, it's pretty standard slasher fare, without giving too much away, but it was entertaining. I can't ask for much more than that. Not everything that gets released is watchable, I guess. This was pretty good. I'd recommend it, especially if you're a big slasher fan.
Okay, so does it have any kind of supernatural element, or is it just a slasher?
Well, that's one thing I like about it, is it stays. It's got this kind of borderline that runs through, especially the latter half of the film, where it kind of plays with the idea that there's something supernatural going on, but it's not overt. You don't have anything like teleporting, anything crazy like that. The exposition, and that's something I need to note, because you know me, I love exposition. I cannot get enough exposition in a horror film, and it's rare for me to really, really enjoy a horror film that isn't just, bathed in it. But this film is pretty light on the exposition. It dips its toe into the water, as it were, with the supernatural elements. Nothing too crazy, but you get the hint that something is going on that isn't, on the level.
Okay, the way you're tiptoeing around it makes me think that there's probably something there to be interested in.
Well, I'll definitely say it's a slow burn to begin with, but then once the bottom falls out, it's like being on a minecart. It just doesn't slow down after that. And I've got to say, I enjoyed the ending a lot, without giving anything away, obviously. It's a relatively new film. I saw it on Shudder. It was recommended to a couple of people that I follow on Twitter, and it's definitely worth a watch. Other than that, there was a movie I remembered hearing about years ago. It's a 2006 horror film, The Breed. It was directed by Nicholas Mastandrea. I couldn't really find much more information on other things he had done, other major projects he'd been involved with. It was written by Robert Conte and Peter Martin Wortman. Big name right off the top. Produced by Wes Craven, Thomas Becker, David Lancaster. And it was a TriStar Pictures film. I'd seen it, and I remembered hearing about it years ago, but it's not something that had stayed with me very long. It's kind of a creature feature. When I read the initial little synopsis, it made me feel like Man's Best Friend. I don't know if you've ever seen that film or if you remember it. That's kind of what I was expecting. It's a little bit different than that. But basically, it's a group of friends again. They're on an island, and they get attacked by killer dogs.
Okay.
Mostly German Shepherds. And they have a puppy lore.
Are these like strange dogs that have been experimented on by scientists, or that are part of some ancient island ritual, or...
One of the characters, who is a vet, had been to the island before. Him and his brother actually are going there with their group of friends because they have like a vacation home there. And he had went there years ago, and there used to be these dogs on the island. They were training these dogs to be guard dogs or attack dogs. And when he came back years later, he learned from his uncle that apparently rabies had broken out, and they had to put all the dogs down. And I think the closest we get to a real explanation is at some point it's alluded to as a theory within the film that they may have been experimenting on the dogs.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say that this is either leftover rabies dogs, or it's the angry spirits of all the dogs that got murdered.
No, the rabies is in there too, or it's that combined with the army attack dogs. They got a new strain of rabies. Is what the closest we get to a real theory.
Well, it sounds like they have enough stuff piled in there that you can just sort of draw your own impressions, which is how I like it. While you were talking, I just looked a little bit into the director, the Nicholas Mastandrea, and it looks like that's his debut, but he was the picked to direct that because he was the assistant director on Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, yeah, I'm usually not into the ones that are just like, I'm not sure what to call them, animal horror. Is there a term for that genre? Like The Birds and Jaws and Anaconda.
I think a lot of the time that just gets lumped in as a creature feature.
Yeah, I suppose that's the best way to do it.
Generally how I heard people describe Crawl, that's a newer alligator film, Crocodile. I can't remember which, sorry. But, yeah, that's probably what I would associate with the most. And one other thing, if a person is bit by these dogs and survives, they kind of start to get this kind of like cabin fever, and it plays with the idea that maybe they get some kind of psychic link to the dogs, because you see two characters that had been attacked and then are wandering around the island or with the group, and they keep repeating the line, "They don't want us here." It did have a very early appearance by Michelle Rodriguez. I think the first movie I remember seeing her in was the first Resident Evil film, and then of course she was in the Fast and Furious films, and off and on Girl Fight was a big movie of hers. I think that was her first like really big role that got her noticed, but I always enjoy seeing her in a film.
And you ever see Day of the Animals? I was just thinking about creature features, trying to think what the last one I actually saw was, and I realized that's probably what it was.
I don't think I have.
Well, I don't recommend it, but it's a 70s one where it's something like, since humans are destroying the ozone, it's causing cosmic rays to hit the Earth that's making all the animals violent. It's got hikers going on a camping trip, and Leslie Nielsen's on the camping trip. but then the cosmic rays start to affect him, so he starts like just screaming at everyone and going caveman. And he's more basically the villain of the movie. But the movie does not explain all of this that I'm saying very good. I had to like have a discussion with the people in the room with me before we realized what was going on. So for the first like half hour you're watching, it just seems like Leslie Nielsen's just going mental for no reason, and it's pretty entertaining.
It's always weird when I see Leslie Nielsen in a horror movie like the first Creep Show, because he's known so much for his comedic talent, but with varying results. He does, he's been in plenty of genres. Creature features are always either hit or miss for me, so I'm willing to give them all a try. I think probably my favorite one from that era would be Squirm. It's about killer earthworms.
Yeah, I've seen very few. I'm not usually a fan of them. I have kind of a soft spot for Tremors, I guess, if you count that. But
I love Tremors.
And it's been a long time since I watched it, but I seem to recall liking The Birds back when I was younger, but I haven't gone back to it in a long time.
You should definitely give Night of the Lepus a try. Killer rabbits.
Somehow that I completely, when you said that on the last episode, it went in one ear and out the other, and then I was editing the audio on last episode, and I was like, wait. I haven't watched it. I've seen clips of it, though, and I don't know. I'm sure there's an appeal there, but I don't think I could make it through it.
We have a friend that's terrified of the 1972 film Frogs. I would not describe it as terrifying, but we know people who do. It's an eco-horror, too, but it's a creature feature.
Yeah, I'm sure Anyanka wouldn't care for Night of the Lepus.
Oh, definitely not.
Well, like I said, I haven't really read much of anything other than a few pages of The Monk. I don't know if you remember in last episode I mentioned that PS1 Halloween horror disc that was a collection of mini-games that tried to have a PS1 vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned at the same time that there was a spiritual successor to it that I couldn't remember the name of at the time. So afterwards I looked to try to remember what the name of that was, and it was the Dread X Collection. And in the process of looking that up, I saw, just a few days ago, Dread X Collection 2 came out. So I went ahead and picked that up, and I've been playing through it a little bit, and I'm liking it pretty good. I saw, reading up on it more, that what initially inspired them to do the Dread X Collection was that PT demo that Hideo Kojima made for Silent Hills, and they just liked how it was like such a short, contained horror experience, and so that's sort of what they wanted to try to make. But they make them through game jams, where basically they just get together and just over the course of a few days put them together and then they're done. And Dread X Collection 1 was made in 7 days, so they gave themselves 10 days for Dread X Collection 2. And since the X stands for 10, so Dread X Collection was 10 games. And since this is Dread X Collection 2, this one is 12 games. Plus, instead of just a menu, they actually have a hub level now where when you start it up, you wake up in like a spooky house and there's some psychologist talking to you over the loudspeaker telling you what the deal is. You're just in a room with a TV and a VCR, and there's a bunch of VHSs locked in steel cases, and you have to go through the house and solve puzzles to get keys to unlock the VHS tapes that have all the minigames on them. And the minigames run a pretty wide gamut, because they did a curated game jam where they picked people that they knew could make quality things in a short amount of time. So you have some that are 3D ones, some that are more sci-fi, you have some that are 2D. There's one that looks kind of like a black and white Apple II game called The Thing in the Lake. It's just about trying to avoid slashers in a camp. The theme for this one, I should say, they said the theme for this game jam was Lovecrafting, so there's sort of a consistency in that. They even have one of the games is a like visual novel dating game where you summon like an elder god and you're trying to hook up with her, and she's making you do rituals that are ending the world in order to hook up with her. There's one that's sort of like a Five Nights at Freddy's setup. Your wife disappeared and you're at a desk having to flip through a book of Lovecraft creatures with notes on them, and there's puzzles and a translation book on the desk, and as you flip through, you're using what you're reading in it to jot notes and solve puzzles, but Nalahotep is slowly moving towards you the whole time, and you have to just look up every now and then to keep him from getting you. I haven't gone through all of them on that yet, but I'm enjoying it a lot.
Definitely need to give that a try. I recently picked up Vampire. I've heard a lot of mixed things about it. I've not heard anything super good about it, but I've heard a few people defend it.
The third-person one, where it has like the social links between people in town?
Yeah. Basically, I believe you're a doctor, or were a doctor, so now you're like struggling against the nature of what you have to do to survive versus what you were in your former life. I haven't got to start it yet, but I did pick it up. I'm going to give it a try while I wait for the new Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines game to come out.
I haven't played Vampire, but one of my roommates did, though. I watched them play a decent bit of it. It looked alright. Alright, well, I think that's it for new things I've engaged with. Is it the same for you?
Oh, yeah.
Alright, so now getting into the news section. Again, this is just sort of whatever we feel personally interested in and choose to go over. I know one thing I did see is that the latest Gamescom panel that they did, they showed off the latest game in the Dark Pictures anthology, Little Hope. I don't know if you're familiar with that series any. The last one was the Dark Pictures anthology, Man of Medan.
Yeah, I have that. I'm a fan of this series mainly because I wanted to play Until Dawn a lot, but it was a PS4 exclusive, and I'm an Xbox man, so when I found out that they were going to start this Dark Pictures anthology series, I got really excited about that.
Yeah, and I should say it's developed by Supermassive Games, who are probably best known for Little Big Planet, but they also did Until Dawn, and so I guess the main thing I've played of theirs is that VR game, the Until Dawn Rush of Blood, where you're on the haunted roller coaster. I love that game, and published by Bandai Namco. But yeah, the first one, the Dark Pictures anthology, they've said that it's supposed to be a series of 8 games that explore different sort of horror tropes and settings with each one. So the first one, Man of Medan, was a diving expedition that got caught up in some ghost ship spookiness based on the SS Oranthe Medan urban legend.
I love ghost ships.
And with the second one, this one's about a bunch of college students that get stranded in a town in New England that has a big witch hunt history after their bus crashes there. And apparently this one's, you'll do a bit of playing in different time periods, and it seems like the witch hunts that happened back then might have some tie to your characters in the modern time. So I guess the first one was ghost ships, and this one's going with witch trials. I'm just hoping it keeps all like the multiplayer elements the first one had, where you could play it single player or co-op, or they had a movie night mode where you pass the controller for each character, because this one is doing the same thing as the last, where there's multiple playable characters that you switch between and pick story choices to determine what ending you get. But yeah, that's supposed to come out October 30th this year, they said.
Auspicious timing.
And yeah, that's going to be on Windows, PS4, and Xbox One. Something else I happened to run into is I saw that, probably not anything I'm going to read, but I saw that they're trying to do some Creepshow young adult horror novels. Creepshow's always kind of, well, I suppose if Tales from the Crypt can have a cartoon for kids, then I guess Creepshow can also.
Oh, I love Tales from the Crypt Keeper.
I think this book, they said it's going to be 2 short stories. One about a girl at a new school, and the first friend she gets seems to be a ghost that's too clingy and is probably ruining her attempts to fit in. And then the second one's about a kid that gets a pet parrot that may be an evil mastermind. So they seem pretty kid-oriented. It's written by an Ellie Cooper, and I looked into what else she'd done, and all I could find was that she'd written for some horror anthology books for Five Nights at Freddy's. Which, that was kind of another true horror, was discovering how many Five Nights at Freddy's books there are.
Oh, there's a huge community and fandom around FNAF. My kids are both big Five Nights at Freddy's fans. My daughter, she has one of the collections, which has 3 of the short story, or 3 of the novellas in it, novellas. And she has 2 other books. She only really likes the stuff by Scott Cawthon.
Shrug. Oh yeah, the game maker. Yeah, Scott Cawthorn, I think.
Yeah, I think the fan base tends to pronounce it so it sounds like coffin. At least for my children, that was always a great source of amusement.
I just remember sitting at a table at a convention, and 2 kids walking by. They were talking about Five Nights at Freddy, and one of them said, "I love Purple Man. He's my bae," and I just didn't know what to think of that.
Well, the movies, there's been, back and forth news on the movies, and creepy animatronics would be good, good fodder for a horror movie. We have the short film, The Hug.
As long as they use actual animatronics and not CG for them.
Oh, yeah, the Banana Splits movie that came out recently.
Actual animatronics, especially after they've had some time to get some wear and tear and for the skinning on them to start eroding, that's pretty genuinely terrifying stuff.
Well, have you seen the Banana Splits movie?
For some reason, I haven't.
No, it is great. Especially if you've ever watched or been a fan of the original show. It is amazing. And there's a short film called The Hug. It was a part of one of Hulu's short film collections for the holiday season. And it is terrific. To be so short, it's just really dark and creepy. Animatronics are good fodder for me.
Yeah, something else interesting. I kind of went down a rabbit hole and started looking into all these writers for these Five Nights at Freddy's books. One of them I found pages saying that they'd written for years, but also no bibliography listed. Just some stuff saying that they'd written for a specific company. And so I went to that company's webpage and found it was basically just a ghostwriting service. And it's just strange to me to think that you could have written for years, but you're contractually not allowed to say anything that you've written because it's all been cleaning up other people's work, yeah.
For other people. Well, Creepshow, they did the new series on Shudder in 2019, and everything I've watched of it was amazing.
I'm waiting to hear if they're gonna do more of it.
Well, if they're trying to branch out into stuff like, young adult novels and stuff, it would make sense that, especially with the reception that series had, I couldn't imagine they would just, drop it. There's a lot of horror pedigree behind Creepshow. You had King and Romero for the first film. I mean, he doesn't really get, much more of a pedigree than that.
Something else I know I mentioned on last episode that I'd seen that a sequel for The Babysitter had been announced, but I actually just, since that episode, I saw that they actually have a trailer for it now, for The Babysitter, Killer Queen, and I was really eager to see that because it was one of those things where it kind of felt like lightning in a bottle for me, and I wasn't really sure that they could keep it going with a second one, but no, that trailer has me feeling pretty hyped for it.
I'm definitely gonna get around to finally watching that film this week.
Yeah, I guess it's hard for me to comment much on it without spoiling it. I guess I can at least say It seems like the plot they're going with is just anyone that got killed in the first one is being brought back for one night in a satanic ritual, and they have to kill the protagonist before that night ends in order to reassert their place on this earth.
Ooh.
So I'm looking forward to seeing that play out. It's probably going to have a very on-the-run vibe going for the whole film. And I also saw, I know you're really into like all the DC horror, like Justice League Dark stuff. And
years ago, it was the Vertigo imprint. It was all of their adult stuff. Hellblazer, Swamp Thing, Book of Fables.
Yeah, where I live right now, we got the DC streaming service just enough to watch a handful of things. And I only caught a few episodes of the 2019 Swamp Thing, but I really enjoyed it and thought it had a pretty good horror vibe going for it. I don't know if it kept that. For all I know, once you get like 6 episodes in, it just turns into some schlocky superhero stuff, but at least in those first 2 episodes I was pretty hooked by it, and I just saw that broadcast rights for it were acquired by the CW, so it's going to start airing there.
Yeah, I saw that, and I can't imagine. I think maybe they're going to cut it down to a 30-minute broadcast slot, so it's actually 23 minutes of airtime, give or take, because there's a lot they would have to edit to make that be able to broadcast on the CW.
I guess we'll find out, because I wanted to watch more of it, but I wasn't willing to subscribe to the DC streaming service just for that, so that should be hitting there and begin airing on October 6th, so I guess I'll find out then. I also saw, in addition to all the remakes we already have going on right now, I saw that Urban Legends is also getting a reboot by Screen Gems, who I guess seems like they mostly do co-productions, but like the 2020 remake of The Grudge with Stage 6 and Ghost House, or Brightburn with Stage 6 and H Collective, or Slender Man with Mythology. I think they have a set to write and direct is Colin Minihan, who's best known for Grave Encounters and most recently for What Keeps You Alive, neither of which I'm familiar with.
I like the Grave Encounters films.
Okay. You seen the all the Urban Legends films?
I've seen the first 3.
I believe there's only 3. I think it's just the first one, then Final Cut or whatever, and then the
Bloody Mary
direct-to-video one. Yeah. You can't say that. My sister's not going to listen now. But the first one was okay in a very dumb way. The second one had an interesting premise, but I recall it being executed in a way that I didn't really like. And then the third one, of course, is just what you'd expect from a direct-to-video sequel to a horror franchise that was never very big in the first place, but could do good stuff with Urban Legends, so I'll keep an eye on it.
I enjoyed the second one a decent bit. You had some decent names in it, and the premise was kind of schlocky, but it was worth watching. I probably wouldn't go out of my way to watch it, but it's one of those where if it's on, I wouldn't mind watching it. I remember very little about Bloody Mary. I remember enough that I haven't watched it
That's
since...
twice now you've done it.
What?
No, nothing, don't worry about it.
No, what? What'd I do?
You said the name.
Oh, good point. Well, luckily, all my lights are on. There is a mirror across from me, though. I remember enough of it that I haven't watched it since my initial viewing. If that tells you anything.
Yeah, I honestly don't remember hardly anything about the third one other than the really bad scene of like CG spiders coming out of the girl's cheek, I think, which I guess that's been retouched on since then by Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I guess.
Well, and I thoroughly enjoy that film.
I had mixed feelings about that one, but I can say with confidence I liked it better than the third Urban Legends film.
Oh, it would be hard to not say that. I think, a reboot for Urban Legends probably wouldn't be nearly as counterintuitive as what some remakes can be instead of extending a franchise, because the idea of an urban legend, especially in this last decade with creepypastas and SCP archives and stuff becoming such a fixture in pop culture and youth culture, the idea of the urban legend is has almost been replaced by creepypastas. If you talk to a 13 or 14-year-old kid right now, they would probably know who Drowned Ben or The Rake was before they would know about the hook man or the babysitter getting calls from upstairs in her own in the house she's babysitting in. So I mean that to me would be a logical point to reboot a franchise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Like I said, you could do something really good with it. Hopefully, if they do it as just using the name and the concept, but not trying to retain any of the canon of the original trilogy.
Exactly.
Just throw all that away and just make a new film based around urban legends. And yeah, like you said, creepypastas would definitely be a really good way to go with it.
And if you go that direction, you kind of have a few different options. You can have someone who's kind of obsessed with these stories, so they're dressing up as Slender Man, or they're staging these murders, around the way that creepypastas would happen.
Oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that. Yeah, that was kind of the deal. Is in Urban Legend 1 and 2, it was just a slasher replicating those. But then in Urban Legends 3, it was actual supernatural stuff happening, I think.
Yeah, and, so there was an episode of Supernatural where they had a stand-in character for Slender Man, and these guys basically want to kill people, so they use supernatural stand-in for Slenderman to commit their murders. The much more likely, unfortunately, scenario is that it's probably going to revolve around the deep web, the dark web. Ooh, and I don't think I'm ready for another film about technology gone wrong.
Well, if you don't want to watch the Urban Legends reboot, you can watch Scream 5 instead. That's set for 2022 now, so they have that slated for the same year as both Halloween Ends and the latest Paranormal Activity, so assuming nothing shifts around those, that's probably going to be a pretty busy October that year. I
loved Scream 4. I'm a fan of the Scream series. I thought Scream 4 did a good job of expanding on the rules that had already been set and kind of evolving with the way culture has evolved since the Scream films. And I'm really excited for Halloween Ends because I loved Halloween 2008 or 2018.
Now for that, you'll still get before that. You'll get Halloween Kills in 2021.
Sure. I'm really excited to see where they go with that series. That alternate reality, I suppose, would be the best way to...
I prefer to think of the original films as the alternate reality.
To each their own. I'm actually a big fan of 4, 5, and 6 in particular. A lot of people look at those films poorly, and I can see it.
Well, I will confess, I have seen them all, but they're all a huge blur in my mind. I'll definitely, before we do any kind of episode focused on Halloween, I'll definitely need to rewatch those.
I just want to see, where they go with it, because they erased, pretty much any of the supernatural element behind Michael Myers, except for the fact that his mask apparently makes dogs and people go crazy, despite the fact that there's no supernatural element around Michael Myers anymore. And they
can confirm dogs don't like masks.
they burned a house down on top of them, so that's pretty much Halloween 2 right there. So I want to see where they go with it. I just recently found out they're doing a new mini-series for The Stand.
Oh, yeah, the Stephen King. I'm not familiar with it at all, but I actually ran into that just because I saw that Marilyn Manson had done a cover of a song, I forget which, that was going to be used in it, and that's how I realized that was going to be a thing.
That is one of my favorite King novels. It's just a very epic novel. It's one of his longest novels. The casting for it looks pretty decent. We're going to have James Marsden. Yeah, most people would probably know him as Cyclops from the X-Men films. But we're going to have Greg Kinnear for a TV miniseries, which it is, released for their streaming platform. So you generally get bigger names for stuff like that. You've got Whoopi Goldberg. I'm assuming she's going to be playing Mother Abigail, which, I could see being great. Whoopi Goldberg's a great actress. You're going to have Marilyn Manson in it, Brian Warner.
Oh, yeah, I think I said Manson's playing the trash can man, is that right?
Yes, that was a character that was pretty much, what's the best way to put it? A minor-ish character in the book, but he was not a character that would have made it into something made for TV when the first The Stand miniseries was released. We've also got Alexander Skarsgård. A lot of people probably know him from True Blood. His brother played Pennywise the Clown in the last 2 It films. Heather Graham. I mean, there's just some really big names attached to this.
Yeah, okay. I haven't read very much Stephen King at all. That's something I need to work on. I've got the Bachman books and one of his more recent ones, The Institute, sitting next to me. But so that's something I'm going to be working on. But I mean, that lineup, yeah, has me interested definitely.
Well, and Skarsgård is actually playing Randall Flagg, the Dark Man. He's one of the characters that is also a big fixture in the Dark Tower series. Any big King fan knows that the Dark Tower series kind of has elements from a lot of Stephen King's other works, as a lot of his works are all interconnected either by minor references or sometimes by, direct references in one story with another.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Dark Tower kind of has crossovers with all Stephen King things, kind of like The Cat That Walks Through Walls did for all the Robert Heinlein books.
Oh, yeah, and Randall Flagg is an awesome character. You love to hate him, and to me, that's one of the things that makes a great villain, is you absolutely love to just hate them and fume at them. Other than that, I mentioned last episode that Supernatural had resumed filming. Well, the finale actually started filming. And it's going to be a 2-week shoot for the finale, which is kind of cool because that tells you that it's probably going to be a longer than average episode. But I imagine if not the first hour or the first half hour will probably be, interviews and talks with the cast and crew. They gave some really, emotional statements about the finale. Jared Padalecki, for example, he posted a photo in his car, and he wrote, "As I head out on my first day on my last season finale, I can't help but be incredibly grateful for all that the Supernatural and the SPN family mean to me. It's been an incredible journey, to say the least. I, for one, am hoping that #Supernatural never dies." And I mean, I love the show. You know that I'm a completely unapologetic fan for this series. And when something runs, 15 seasons, I mean, it's 15 years I've been watching this show. If it's a show you enjoy, you become attached to these characters, and I'm sad to see them go. I'm glad the show is getting a proper send-off and not just, getting the axe in between seasons like what happens with so many shows. So I've got kind of, a bittersweet feeling on that one. I'm sad to see it go. I'm glad it's getting a send-off, and I mean, it's time. It's been 15 years, and there's nowhere else they can go with the show, really. But they've always been kind of, like a family outside of the show. They have their little anecdotes with one another. They've always, been very friendly with one another. I imagine you see someone 3/4 of a year every day for 15 years. It's going to be different when you don't get up every Monday and see that person. So I'm definitely excited about that. It's slated to air October 8th, the last portion of the last season. So I'm really looking forward to that. And also very sad about it too.
Okay, so I guess this is our first proper feature section for the show, and as it is the first one, it seemed like the best place to start would be at the beginning. So what I wanted to do is sort of do an overview of the horror genre, where it came from, and how it developed in its early days, and where a lot of the things that we just take for granted as the horror landscape now initially came from. So I know most any source I've looked into about this over time usually starts with the gothic horror, and I think there is a good reason for that. If you go back much further than that, then you start getting into the period before the Age of Enlightenment, and at that point you don't really have a need for a specific horror genre because the supernatural is all around you in everyday life. Elements of horror, if we go into the horror story, they go back further than writing does. In our earliest legends, we have stuff like, the Minotaur, Cerberus, or the Gorgons, or even stuff like in the Book of Revelations, if we're trying to go into our earliest literature we have for elements of horror. But of course, at that point, it's not really horror. I mean, certainly I'm sure ideas like that were frightening to people back then. Kind of hard to say, but...
Well, biblically, we also have things like the Legion and the Leviathan.
Mm-hmm. Something I found in our early history a lot, too, is a pretty consistent thing across cultures from, like, the oldest eras, like Babylonian times, is a fear of sorcerers and magic. And I know even, like, in the Bible, it has a few various points in it where it condemns sorcery. And, of course, if we're going to be covering the history of horror, though, another element that's going to be very important is, while on one thread we'll need to study the mythos as it goes forward, there's also just the growth of entertainment mediums over time. Obviously, you can't have a horror movie without movies. You can't have a horror book before books.
And I think one of the really great things about the evolution of storytelling mediums is word of mouth. It's amazing to me that throughout our evolution, word of mouth, even in this day, is still a constant. And that is just absolutely amazing to me, that the simplest form of storytelling has managed to remain pertinent since people started walking around and talking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, certainly I think like the most primordial horror story is like the campfire story or just the folk tale. And most...
go outside, dark eat you.
And most scary stories get a little embellished with time, but just like ancient myths, like about the Minotaur and so on, often if you dig back far enough, you start finding things that you think give a hint that there's a bit of truth to them, and that's probably something that can make spooky stories even spookier, is knowing it's not all real, but some of it might be.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And of course, it would take a while before we'd get any sort of a caramelized, concrete horror genre, because back then, we had like the Greek theater, and then once Rome came into prominence with the Roman Empire, they basically copied Greek theater. But then, of course, after that, you get to the point where, with the fall of Rome, when the Goths, which were a Proto-Germanic tribe, invaded Rome, and I wanted to go ahead and mention this point because Gothic horror gets its name from the Goths, and I think starting here sort of gives an impression of where that name kind of came from, but I'll come back to that a bit later. So, of course, after the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire had spread into a whole lot of Europe. Even Great Britain was part of the Roman Empire for a time, although they never finished taking all of it. And so because of that, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed and all of that Roman influence left Britain, which we'll be focusing on Britain a lot because obviously a lot of that's where Gothic horror really got its start. But once all that Roman influence left Britain, all that Roman architecture that they'd built just got torn down and dismantled and reused for other things, and it all just sort of fell into ruin. And that sort of remainder of these like great Roman ruins in England is sort of what came to be associated with when you described something as Gothic then, and that's where the term Gothic horror came from, was this idea of it being a throwback to these earlier, more romantic times. But in the meantime, you hit what was called the Dark Ages. At one point, it seems like people don't like that term anymore and prefer to just call it the Middle Ages now. In this time period, you sort of fall back into a very supernatural period where there's folklore all over the place and tons of legends and worries, and you don't need horror novels in this period because it's happening all around you. You believe there are witches, you believe there are werewolves and revenants coming back from the dead.
Oh yeah, and I mean it's all has its basis in a complete lack of science at the time.
No, there wasn't really. Well, they had their concept of science for the time, but
yeah, but they things even today that are commonplace, like certain birth defects or physical disabilities, they had no scientific concept of why that would happen. So, like you said, it all goes back to folklore. If someone was born with a cleft palate, at some points it was a sign that, something as out there as this person is destined to, rise from the dead after, they're buried, or it was, a curse on the family by a witch or other supernatural creatures that had afflicted the family.
Yeah, because that was the philosophy of the times. And when I say philosophy, I don't mean like your personal set of beliefs or moralities. I mean it as in the way you perceived the world. Post Age of Enlightenment, we had the empirical thought and scientific method took over, where you see something and you start going through the process of thinking, why is it this way, and what are the causes and effects? Before that, you had the philosophy was just pure spiritualism. Everything that happened was just because it was supposed to be, or it was the work of deities, and that was just accepted as the way the world was. And laws in medieval Europe, not everywhere, but there are concrete examples of laws from medieval Europe where werewolves were mentioned in the laws. And of course, it would take a while for science to get anywhere and put an end to that, because you had alchemists at the time, who believed everything was made of mercury and sulfur in different quantities, and they would often get punished because they're working with sulfur, which was called brimstone back then, which is associated with the devil. So you get things like in the 13th century, alchemist Robert Bacon getting jailed for heresy.
And that's another thing, the nature of heresy then. Some of the concepts that were so commonplace back then would be heretical now. I mean, things like blaming birth defects on the supernatural and such. So it's kind of odd that, heresy was a big focal point then, but in itself, it was filled with heresy.
Right, and of course, our records from this period are kind of lacking, and things finally start to get on their feet again is, of course, when we hit the Renaissance in like the 15th and the 16th century, which is, of course, around the same time that you're also having the Protestant Reformation. That church that sort of kept culture in Europe stabilized for all that time is starting to hit some issues around this time. And I don't know if it's because the Renaissance is just making us have more records of things, or if it's the Protestant Reformation causing a sort of like a faith problem in the people. But for some reason in the 15th century, that's when you start seeming to suddenly get this big influx of folklore stuff, like accusations of werewolves and witch trials were cranking up a whole lot back then. And I should say back then, I know these days everyone's very familiar with witch trials, but back then, accusations of people being werewolves was super common during witch trials, and they were commonly hung together. Hanging was more common than burning them, actually, at least at that point. Ironically, at that same time, alchemy is actually blowing up and getting really popular then, because just court appearances, I guess. You're not a proper noble if you don't have your alchemist working for you. At that same time, once you start getting into like the late 1500s, we start having a lot of records start coming around then of things like in 1573 we have records of Gilles Garnier being tortured until he confessed that he was a werewolf, and then he was burned at the stake. And then not long after that, 1597, King James, the King of England at the time, he actually wrote a dissertation on witchcraft called Demonology. So this stuff wasn't superstition, this was the way the world was to most of these people. And of course, any statement like this about a culture is very generalized. In any time period, you're going to have people that don't agree with that.
Well, you even had Peter Stump. He was executed in 1589. He was what we know today as a serial killer. He was a German serial killer, but he was accused of, and I quote, werewolfery. Amongst other things such as cannibalism. Now, in more present times, a lot of people think maybe he was a political victim, because what led to his execution is two hunters said that they saw him transform from a wolf into a man, and they chased him into the woods and cornered him, and he was executed by breaking. That was a prominent case at that time. And, these around 18 or 19 victims that spanned a period of 25 years.
Yeah, and all these things that seem very backwards and primitive to us now, you have to think at the same time these are happening is at the same time that all the progressive things that brought culture forward are happening. I mean, at the same time that Christopher Columbus was coming to America, that was right between the two periods of Vlad the Impaler going on his stints against the Ottoman Empire. I think he was actually imprisoned in a brief period between while Christopher Columbus was coming to America. Anyways, yeah, but jumping forward a century from Columbus, and you get to the late 1500s when these werewolves are getting killed, and King James is writing Demonology. And of course, this is around the same time you have Marlowe's just written Dr. Faustus, and Shakespeare's just gotten started writing. And of course, Shakespeare's actually going to be really relevant towards the development of gothic horror. I think you've actually read more Shakespeare than me, Daniel, but he has things like Richard III, where he's haunted by ghosts, and King Lear has some pretty morbid stuff, like girls popping people's eyeballs out.
Even Macbeth.
Yeah, and of course Macbeth, yeah, that out damned spot scene where she can't get the blood off her hands.
Well, I mean, he's not a name that immediately jumps to most people's heads when you think of a horror, but he wrote about, forest spirits frequently, ghosts, witches, prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
There was...
Boil, boil, toil and trouble. Mm-hmm. That's from him. Yeah, and that did start off like a sort of phase of revenge tragedies. They're also called tragedies of blood, which you could sort of see that as an ancestor to later horror. But
oh, definitely. I mean, there's definitely like at the very least, a thriller aspect to those types of stories.
And in the 1600s, that's when you finally start to hit the age of enlightenment. That doesn't happen immediately. You don't go from one day believing in vampires to the next day you don't. All the Age of Enlightenment does is you start applying the same scientific method to trying to understand vampires and where they come from, and only through years of that do you start to realize maybe these aren't real. Once you hit the 1600s, theater kind of died out for a little bit. It started getting a reputation as making people lazy and criminal and spreading the plague, which of course that part might be partially true as long as you have some plague in your area. But I mean, that's okay because you still have real horror going on in the world. I mean, that's around the time in 1610, that's when you had Countess Elizabeth Bathory of Hungary was finally arrested after they figured out that she'd been supposedly torturing and killing all these girls and bathing in their blood, as well as all kinds of other things. There's so many stories about what went on with her that it's hard to know which are true and which aren't. You had all the Protestants coming to America, and so you have the Salem witch trials in the 1690s. The point where horror really starts to become something we can really get around, though, is once you hit the 18th century, the 1700s. For some reason, around that time, there was a really big scare about vampires in Eastern Europe, mostly around Serbia.
Oh yeah, and I mean that's one thing I've always been drawn to about the vampire and myth and in folklore is you have all these different points where we have it recorded, where all these different places in the world have had these upsurges of the fear and belief and the undead creature that would drain life, but pretty much every society and culture has some version of the vampire, and of course they can be drastically different from one place to the other, but one thing that remains constant between all of them, whether it's a creature that has risen back from the grave or it's a demonic spirit, is it's always like a longing and a draining of life.
Yeah, and in most of these cultures, they're undead of any kind. And even before, the vampire really took off in Western Europe, there was still the concept of the undead that came back and wanted blood or flesh, just things like ghouls or revenants. A lot of this ties into, because people weren't very familiar with how to fully determine if somebody's dead or not, you ended up with things where people were buried alive or mistaken for dead. And that's where we get things like the dead ringers, where they would try to tie a bell to a person's toe, so that way if they were alive, they could ring the bell from inside the grave. And in fact, the staking vampires thing, that initially started as an earlier thing where it was just because they were worried that the dead might get up. To keep them from getting up, they would just stake them down to the ground.
Yes, it was to tie them to the earth physically. And it's funny because there was such a nature of suppression around things like examining the human body after death. There was kind of like a suppression of experimentation, because that in itself was almost heretical. So they didn't, especially your average person, who was a farmer in a town or something like a cobbler, they had no idea of what to expect from a human body that had been in the ground for 2 weeks, much less, 3 months down the road. And if you had buried someone in, by today's standards, a shallow grave in a wooden box in the middle of winter, 3 months down the road, their body probably isn't going to have decayed to a state where it would not be a stretch of the imagination to mistake them for, getting up at night and walking around and, hunting for prey.
Yeah, and it's common trivia now that your hair and fingernails continue to grow for a good while after you die. People back then didn't know that, so they dig up a body and see that, and...
You have that, but then there's also, the notion that even that, the nails and the hair continuing to grow, is that it's more as the body decays, the skin starts to draw up, and it gives the illusion that the nails and the teeth specifically are in an advanced stage of growth. And it also, gave way to the clawed fingers, because the skin and the fingertips will shrink away from the nails as the body begins to desiccate, and it would give the illusion of like these predatory animal claws and fangs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's a lot of records of like official investigations that were done around this time, pretty spread out. There's a record in 1725 of vampire case in Servia that was documented by an Austrian imperial provisor Frumbald. A few years after that, one of the more famous ones, I think, is in 1732. Johannes Fluckender wrote Seen and Discovered, which was basically about a place where he went where he was convinced there was vampirism, and he documented on it there, and has notes about how all the bodies that they dug up that seemed fresh were beheaded and burned, while all the ones that were decomposed were put back in their graves. And he sent this report to professionals and officials of the time, and it was published in newspapers and scientific journals. And I've heard that specific case was one of the ones that popularized the term vampire in Western Europe, although it seems like some sources are inconsistent, but I've seen things saying that vampire was just a generic word for undead in that area, which sort of matches up with what I was saying earlier about vampires and ghouls are pretty much the same thing at this point in history.
Yeah, it would be much later when the vampire took on the specifically hunting for innocence or the sexual nature, kind of got grafted into the vampire.
And around this time, though, theater had actually taken off again. It had actually taken off too much and had become really like a tawdry and lewd. So what's effectively the first Prime Minister of England passed a licensing act of 1737 at the time that sort of restricted what plays could be shown in what theaters to clamp down a bit in England. But his youngest son, Horace Walpole, would go on to write The Castle of Otranto, which is what's considered by most people to be the first Gothic horror novel. And he wasn't specifically trying to create any kind of horror novel when he wrote it. What was actually going on was, you had the Shakespeare from the late 1600s, and then once you get into the 1700s, people are getting way more into rationalism and realism as a result of the Age of Enlightenment. And so you had some people like Voltaire specifically was writing some criticisms of Shakespeare for how unrealistic they were, and there's an impression that art should be more realistic now. And Horace Walpole didn't like that. He seemed like he was sort of a man romanticized by the past. He had a big manor house built for himself in what was considered an archaic style of architecture then, what they'd taken to pejoratively calling Gothic architecture. And in his manor house he had a nightmare about a giant hand in the house, and that's part of what inspired him to write the story. But he also just wanted to sort of do a callback to the way Shakespearean works were and draw in some of those supernatural elements again. So in 1764 The Castle of Otranto was published, but even though Walpole had his own publishing house, he published it through somebody else and claimed that it was just a translation by some made-up person of some text that was found somewhere, which in some notes he wrote in later versions of the book later, he said that was as much for the mystery and thrill of it as to protect his reputation if the book did bad. But I have read that book, and I did enjoy it, but it's got an odd amount of almost camp to it. It's constantly alternating between the funny bits and the bits that are too tame by our modern standards now to be scary, but I'm going to go over the plot a little bit just because it's very central to the Gothic horror genre as a whole. It's basically a man, Manfred, is in charge of the Castle of Otranto, and he's trying to hold on to his legacy of it, and his way of doing it is he has this part of the last known proper heirs to Otranto that he's trying to marry off his son to. But then his son gets killed, a giant helmet mysteriously falls on him from out of nowhere, and so Manfred, still wanting to hold on to the Castle of Otranto, decides he's going to marry that girl, but unfortunately he's already married, so he has to get divorced from his wife, but in order to get divorced from his wife, he has to get the preacher to agree to it, and the preacher doesn't want to agree to it, but then a man shows up to help the girl escape from the castle, but then it shows up, Manfred captures that boy, and then it turns out that boy is the priest's long-lost son, so now Manfred's holding that boy captive to get the priest to agree to getting him divorced from his wife, so that Manfred can marry his dead son's fiancée, and goes on much like that until eventually more and more ghosts keep popping up in the house because they're not happy about what's going on, until eventually the ghosts take over and sets it as rightful heirs to the castle, get it back. And even at the time, I don't think it was regarded as very scary, because there's notes from like Anne Radcliffe, who would go on to be one of the seminal Gothic horror writers, where she herself says that it was more funny than scary. But after Castle of Otranto, you get a ton of imitators trying to copy his style because the book's widely popular. However, unfortunately, the supernatural bit that he was bringing into it didn't really stick at the time. So a couple years later, in 1777, you get The Champion of Virtue, later republished as The Old English Baron, written by Clara Reeve, which stripped out all the supernatural elements, but it kept what would be the motifs of the Gothic horror going forward. The spooky house, the damsel in distress, dark catacombs and cold pathways, risks of supernatural, but never actually supernatural. And after that, you hit Anne Radcliffe, and she's pretty much the most hailed of the Gothic horror writers and the most associated with it, although all of her books have the house, the creepy butler, the candlelight, the people wandering the dark hallways, seeing things, hearing them go bump in the night. This is where you get to the point where you're writing books that are all about creating these sensations of being unsettled and terror, although it's notable that in all of Anne Radcliffe's books, they have supernatural things that appear to be in them, but by the end of each of the books, they always end up being revealed to have been something else. I suppose that's a setup for what you get later on with like Scooby-Doo, where there's always monsters, but by the end of the episode you're always going to learn that it was just Farmer Jenkins from down the road. And I think kind of the pinnacle point for this first wave Gothic horror was The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis, which, as I said, I'm in the process of reading, but I'm far too early in it to speak from my own experience. But what historically said about it is that basically the monk brings the supernatural back into it, and beyond that also tries to bring in a lot more visceral things to creep out and disturb the reader. It has like actual ghost stories, like adapted from German ghost stories from around the time, people getting stuck in crypts and carrying around dead babies and all kinds of stuff in it. And so it was a big sensation both in the good way and the bad way, and ironically the person that wrote it ended up getting elected onto Parliament right before it became published, which created a little bit of extra outcry about somebody wrote something this awful and they're running our government, which of course I believe he took it out of print and tried to republish it, dumbed down a bit, but of course that only made it more popular. But at the peak for the Gothic horror, from that point forward, it sort of starts dying down a bit, and I think that's most highlighted when you get to like Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, which isn't a Gothic horror really, but it's basically that was originally written in 1803 but not published until 1817. Northanger Abbey was the scary movie or Scream of that time period, because the main character in it's so obsessed with Gothic horror that she's constantly imagining that she's in a Gothic horror, and people it's just creating humorous circumstances all around her as she overreacts to things because she's watched too many horror movies, basically.
Well, and like with Jane Austen, there's so many tentpole works that she's known for. She kind of dabbled in various genres, but a lot of that gets overlooked because she's so well known for these tentpole works of hers.
And I should say Northanger Abbey even specifically mentions a lot of Gothic horror books, including some of Anne Radcliffe's, like The Mysteries of Udolpho, which I think is her most famous one, which I should say I have read through Mysteries of Udolpho also by Anne Radcliffe, and it doesn't really register as a horror book to me. Most of it's just very like a pictorial depiction of a person's life, and it doesn't really get into the Gothic horror till you get to like the last little chunk of the book when the damsel's kidnapped to the spooky manor house where the horror movie kicks in. Around that same time, you get something really interesting going on, which is sort of the next big nexus point for the horror genre to explode, which is happened in 1816, which is called The Year Without a Summer. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
So 1816 was called The Year Without a Summer, because just that summer there was just constant rain and bitter cold. There's a lot of documents and diaries from that time saying that it was winter and summer. Skies were overcast and there was major food shortages all over the world. And it's suspected now to have been a volcanic winter event caused by the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. And even in America, there's diaries from that time, talking about there being a persistent dry fog along the east coast and about how cold the summer was and it affecting crops, and he was saying that the weather was backwards. So 1816, that summer, a couple young kids, 18 to early 20s, go out to a villa in Switzerland, and since they can't really go out because it's just raining non-stop, they decide they're just going to sit in and read scary stories. And after reading a few of them, specifically a lot from Phantasmagoriana, a French anthology of German ghost stories, they decide, well, since we're all trapped inside, let's have a writer's jam, and we'll all each write a spooky story. And these people are Lord Byron, his physician John William Polidori, Percy Shelley, Mary Godwin, who would later be Mary Shelley, and Mary's stepsister Claire Clairmont. The name that should stand out to most people would be Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus. While she didn't finish that book that summer in that house, that is where she came up with the concept. And Lord Byron wrote a short story about a vampire, which, keep in mind, at this point, a vampire is not a noble man in fangs that turns into a bat. A vampire is still just a person that comes back from the dead and feeds on others, and not even by biting the neck with fangs. They don't have fangs yet.
Depends on what part of the world you're from. But yeah, for the most part, there's not really a solidified idea in the mainstream consciousness yet.
Yeah, that fragment that Lord Byron wrote, really all that is just, and it's somewhat based off Lord Byron, it's just a person traveling through Europe with a companion that seems a bit socially distant, and the companion's like philandering with a bunch of women and seems to be leaving trouble in his wake. And then he reaches a point where he's going to die, but he says he's going to come back, and that's really all there was to it. Later on, Polidori would sort of adapt from that and write an actual story called The Vampire that pretty much covers that same plot but goes a bit past it, where as the man's dying, he makes the main character promise that he won't mention what's happened for a certain period of time, and then when the main character goes back to society, that person that he saw died is back there and now dating his sister, and then the main character just starts trying to put a stop to it, but because of his oath he can't say that he knows that person's undead. And so eventually his lashing out gets people thinking he's crazy, and eventually the vampire marries his sister, and then she dies, and then the vampire runs off and gets away. I have read that. It's a very dry read. There's no dialogue in it. It's all everything, and it's written like. And then he approached her and checked if she was okay, and she said she was. So he went. It's like written like that. But it was one of the first things published in Europe, possibly the first that was called The Vampire that had mass mainstream public appeal. And of course Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I did gloss over that a bit, but I don't think that one really needs any introduction here. I think everyone's familiar with that work. And I do think it's interesting, though. I do think Frankenstein sort of, unlike a lot of the earlier stuff, the monster is made through science, and that sort of follows the trend of something you're going to see throughout the 1800s. As they go on, there's going to be more and more of a trend towards horror having more and more scientific logic behind it, and eventually they'll just cut out the supernatural entirely. And sorry, you were going to say something?
Oh, no, I'm just glad we're finally to a point as a society where no one ever has to be told at this point anymore that Frankenstein is the scientist and the antagonist in a lot of ways in the book, not the monster. And I've always liked, what I particularly liked about this story is it's, especially at this time, it was uncommon that the story was told from the viewpoint of someone who could realistically be considered the villain.
Yeah, well, what I've seen said and that I like is that if you haven't read Frankenstein, then you think Frankenstein is the monster. If you have read Frankenstein, then you know that Frankenstein is not the monster. But if you understand Frankenstein, then you know that Frankenstein is the monster.
Yes. I mean, in movies, of course, they have to make the doctor much more sympathetic than the monster because people are going to gravitate and relate to human, as it were, more. And he's the lead, so you have to be able to kind of have that attachment to him. But his actions from the very get-go are very selfish. He doesn't take any care for what his actions will lead to, the consequences. Everything that happens can logically be traced back directly to his actions. In later adaptations, we get further and further away from that point.
Yeah, like in the Hammer one, they just sort of try to make him be his own sort of thrilling villain in addition to the monster.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I can say interesting of note is around, just to sort of link time periods together, is around the time Frankenstein gets published in 1818, Edgar Allan Poe would have actually been going to school overseas in England at the time that was released. And of course, he would have been just a schoolboy then. But at this point, once we're in like 1820, we're hitting a point where the next big thing's going to change the way the world is, which is, the Industrial Revolution. It's going to make it where there's a lot more people reading, but it's also going to change the way things can be distributed, and up until this point, it's only really been the aristocracy that reads, and most books have been in this format of 3 large volumes, and in the course of the 1800s, we're going to see that shift to more simple, shorter things that are like published on cheaper products and are read by the everyman. Theater at the time, though, while Gothic horror would start drying up in popular literature, it would shift over into the theater around this time because of that 1737 act I mentioned that made it where plays could only be shown in a few places. People had gotten around that by the law only really restricted spoken word plays, so it turns out if you just put enough music in your play, it doesn't count anymore, so that's where the melodramas came from, which of course we now associate with just the style of acting, but in the 1820s, melodrama was like really booming and was based a lot on Gothic horror, so you had a lot of adaptations from things there, like The Bride of the Isles, apparently really terrible play based on the vampire, but they made the vampire Scottish, and apparently like people laughed at it even then. I don't think it did very good. But now that you have the Industrial Revolution kicking in and all the mythology's been pushed down to the point where now we have all these books about supernatural things just for entertainment, horror in the 1820s and 30s starts shifting over more to like true crime drama. And part of that's just because it's not just the fate of the supernatural, it's also the increase of the fear of urbanization, because industrialization is drastically shifting populations around, and suddenly you're going from knowing everyone in your town to now you're just in a big city and nobody knows anyone, and that's normal enough now, but back then it wasn't to a lot of people, and so that makes the true crime genre be a much more terrifying and much more real to you. You're worried about all these strangers in the alleyways, and funnily enough, we go from this earlier phase where people don't know anything about bodies decay, so they're like digging them up and deciding they're vampires. In the 1800s, you get to the point where people are wanting to study bodies enough that people are killing people and selling these bodies to physicians, and people at seminars where they're going over anatomy are like recognizing the bodies on the table as somebody that was alive last week.
Well, and with the Industrial Revolution, you start to experience something that is going to have a major impact over the next century in storytelling, all facets, but particularly horror, and that's immigration. You're going to start seeing a lot more immigration of peoples from one area to another because they're following employment, basically. And that's something that will become a major overtone and stories over the next century, and that's a xenophobia of type in society.
I mean, yeah, I even remember reading some stuff about how at a point when horror novels were seeming to get too horrifying in England, they were blaming it on influence from German horror novels.
As you previously stated, this era would give rise to Edgar Allan Poe. His name is well known in pop culture, the mainstream. We learn about him at school. He has a lot of really famous stories. One of my favorites is The Cask of Amontillado. The Fall of the House of Usher is one of his more well-known stories. You have The Mask of the Red Death. You also have Hop Frog. It's something that Poe wrote about a lot, kind of the revenge drama. It's, it's got tones of Shakespeare because Shakespeare wrote, a lot of revenge drama. And it's basically about a jester who is kidnapped and forced to become the jester for this king, and he's treated like crap. His friends are treated like crap. So he basically gets the king and his friends to dress up in these costumes for this banquet parade event in their honor, and he murders them all by setting their costumes on fire.
I'm glad you mentioned that one. It's one of the few I'm familiar with. I mean, it's a little more than that. He gets them all tangled up in it. They're in a Rat King-esque ball of burnt nobles hanging from the ceiling by the end of it.
That's one thing notable in Poe's work. When someone's going to die, it's never that they just die. There's always that element of horror and torture, like I mentioned, The Cask of Amontillado. he doesn't just drag him down there and kill him. He gets him drunk and befriends him and then drags him down there, chains him to a wall, and makes him witness himself literally being buried alive. And some of the descriptors in that story, like when he's almost finished the wall and he talks about how he can still hear the bells jingling.
Oh, the bells. The tabulation of the bells.
Yes. And then he even takes that last dick move and drops the torch in there with him before he, closes in the last brick.
That's just going to use up your oxygen faster.
Yeah, and I mean...
Well, most of the Poe I read when I was really young. One I read actually recently was The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. Are you familiar with that one?
Yes.
Whenever we get to Lovecraft later, it reminded me a lot of him. Both the title, it reminds me of like The Mysterious Kate of Walter Sullivan or whatever, but The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar made me think of a Reanimator a bit. It's about someone that gets hypnotized right as they're dying, and it sort of traps them between, and I have been sleeping, and now I'm dead.
This perverse, elongation of death, the Mask of the Red Death, you have a main character who spends a large portion of the story trying to almost literally escape death. And so much of the horror in it comes from the fact that he is quite literally being stalked by death for trying to evade it. And it's all just very drawn out. Even in the Telltale Heart, it's very tense. As a child, I didn't really get it that much. It was something we had to, read in school. But as I got older, I mean, it's very, unnerving. You're sitting there trying to have a conversation with somebody, and you can literally, hear the thumping of a heart of someone you just murdered and buried. As a kid, the whole thing about the eye, oh, God, that just made me cringe. All the fixation, where he opens the door just a crack,
that's a good
and
one,
the beam of his lantern falls right on the eye. Ugh.
I could sit here and talk about Poe all day, and I'm sure he'll get his own episode at some point, but unfortunately we should probably move on. Obviously, anything that we're discussing in this episode is going to be in kind of a broad strokes overview way. Poe had a really interesting life, and we can easily have a full episode about him, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to, drop a little bit of flavor for me personally on Poe there. But yes, we can scoot forward.
Yeah, well, Poe, he died in 1849. Once you hit the 40s, though, you start hitting the point where the penny dreadful is really taking off. At this point, literacy was high enough and publication was high enough that you start hitting this explosion of that cheap literature for people. And so basically you'd have these things that the work people would buy that would only cost a penny, and that'd be just, short stories that they'd read or single chapters that they would buy, wrap up their lunch in it when they're done with it or some such.
Yeah, it was almost like a precursor to the comic book,
Yeah.
You would pop in the shop, every week or every 2 weeks to get your next fix.
Yeah, I know that they'd sell similar things at hangings when they were still doing them too, where you can just pay a penny to get this little pamphlet about who's getting hanged, and you could buy little caricatures of who's getting hanged.
Yeah, it's almost like the birth of a true crime as we know it in the modern day. We have documentaries about serial killers and stuff now, and it's that's kind of like the starting point for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here's a biography on the man you're about to watch die.
And of course, we're well into the point where the realist novel is what's prized and sought after. So people had a pretty low opinion now of gothic horror at this point, and so I think they were called penny bloodies or something like that at first.
And the penny awfuls.
Yeah. And so of course, it's all just penny dreadful. Sounds fine now. You're saying pay a penny for something dreadful, but except they actually mentioned that this is awful stuff that's ruining our society. The poor people are paying pennies to read this trash, and it's putting these awful ideas about murder and the macabre in their head, and it's going to turn them all into reprobates.
It's the precursor to the comics authority.
Yeah.
With Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror.
I should say. And of course, at this point, you're still not at the phase where everybody has books.
Oh, yeah.
Books are more common, but purchasing a book is still like the equivalent to what is nowadays buying a TV. So most books at this point are being circulated through like the circular libraries that are on like trains or in local shops and stuff, where you're just constantly rotating out your books. But if you're well-to-do and the middle class is just starting to become a concept at this point, but the poor people are buying these penny dreadfuls, and a ton of what is in modern horror came from these things. Because, obviously this is the point where horror is populist now. It's like everybody's reading this.
Yeah, so you have an explosion of people writing it, and everyone's trying to one-up or become the next unique thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I only made a note of a few of these that are the more important ones, but one of them is Varney the Vampire, or the Feast of Blood. It's a silly name, I know.
I know.
But
I've heard.
I don't know if Varney was a scary name back then, but it certainly hasn't held up. But a lot of what we think of when we think of vampires now, this is where it happened, because Varney the Vampire, this was like a serial, like every week you go buy your one chapter of Varney the Vampire. So this thing went on forever. If you decide you're going to read this, he wrote it for 2 years, you decide you're going to read this thing, you're getting multiple books of it, and since it was written chapter by chapter with like a cliffhanger on each one, it's not very consistent and things are constantly changing, and that's why vampires have such a weird and consistent power set now.
Is it wrong that all I picture is Ernest P. Worrell in a Dracula costume?
Probably, because this is really like where like the aristocrat vampire came from. Before it was just anybody that died. In this story, it's an ancestor of the family that you have a portrait of the wall on comes back and sneaks into the damsel's room at night and has fangs and bites her neck. All that's new with Varney the Vampire.
Yeah. Jim Varney, though. That's all I can see.
I haven't read... I do have a copy of it. I haven't read too far into it. I'm liking it so far, but my understanding is that, like anything that starts out good, but you have to keep pumping out weekly, it jumps the shark and becomes really bad really quickly. But I guess we'll see. Other big stuff from the Penny Dreadful phases you had, like by George W.M. Reynolds, you had Wagner and the Werewolf, and The Mysteries of London, which is more of true crime. You had, in 1867, you had The String of Pearls, was the initial title, but as it went on, it would change into being Sweeney Todd. You had a whole lot of, what you could almost call like medical horror coming around in this time, where people are just, kind of like I said with like back in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, how they're using science to create the monster. You start having stuff like the Poe story about where they hypnotize somebody at the moment of death and study it, and a lot of stories about people that are like presumed dead and gathered up into corpse piles and stuff like that, and things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is about a scientist making a formula that separates their base instincts from their elevated mind. And horror is a thing now. For the Gothic horror, even though we call it Gothic horror now, for the most of the time that it was around, people just called it romance literature. It was just a subgenre of it that they didn't really have a name for. So we're starting to get into the 20th century now. I think the last thing I might want to mention from before we cross over that threshold is La Théâtre du Grand Guignol in Paris. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too bad. Which that was a theater that was opened in 1897, and I think a lot of people know about it now just from it had a scene you might remember that it was in Interview with the Vampire, I think. Mm-hmm. But this was a theater its specialty was horror, and that's not all they showed. They showed a variety of shows, and they would usually do a sort of like hot and cold thing where they would show a horror immediately followed by a comedy. But the horror is what people really came there for, and the theater was made in like a retrofitted cathedral, so it gave it this big like gothic look. They had like these stage plays, and they were always really focused on like how visceral the murders were, and they had all these props for doing all these visceral murders. And the person that owned it knew a guy that would make him like fake eyes that other actors could eat during the shows, and they would splatter blood on the crowds. And it was put in a part of town that was really kind of seedy, so that kind of gave an extra thrill, I guess, to the people that were going there. And I've also read like anecdotes there that in a normal theater you could like pay for balcony seats. This is retrofitted from a cathedral, so here you could pay extra for booths that were converted from confessional booths. And there's a benefit for that, because if you don't want people to see you there, you can get one of those. But also people would just get the confessional booths and just get it on in there until they got so loud that the actors would have to stop and start yelling at them to cut it out. That theater was actually still going well into the 20th century, but eventually ownership changed hands, and they tried to change the style they were going for, and probably just because of cinema becoming a thing, it just slowly faded.
To that style of theater, anyways, in the Addams Family, the first Addams Family live-action film, when Pugsley and Wednesday are doing their skit for the school show, like a play type, and they're having the sword fight, and then one of them gets their arm cut off, and he's just spraying blood all over the audience.
Yeah. And for anyone that's curious, Grand Guignol, it basically just means big puppet.
Oh, well, fine, because puppets are creepy as hell anyways.
That was just another one of those things from that 1737 Licensing Act that tried to restrict theater. So puppet theater was another one of the genres that got big for a little while.
Old-ass puppets are creepy, man.
A couple years before that theater opened, that would have been when H.P. Lovecraft was born.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's the next big face of horror after Poe, which I know he himself was inspired a bit by Poe, but something else interesting I noticed when looking into Lovecraft was apparently he was really inspired a lot by Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the poem by Coleridge, and apparently like Poe and Mary Shelley were both also really into that, so there's this sort of consistent people being into Rime of the Ancient Mariner thing with big figures in horror, although in Lovecraft's case I think it was specifically just that he really liked the illustrations in a copy of Paradise Lost, and then he just saw a copy of some poems by Coleridge, and they had the same illustrator, and so that's really what hooked him on it. But yeah, and then of course he discovered Poe, and that's I think what really took Lovecraft down the horror road. I know you're way more versed in Lovecraft than I am, so maybe you should talk about him a bit.
Well, Lovecraft, one of the first draft of one of his first stories he wrote, The Beast in the Cave, was written in 1904. So he was, 14 at the time. Of course, it wouldn't be published till much later. But a lot of what Lovecraft did at the time, he didn't even really consider horror. He considered it weird fiction. It would have, slotted right in well to weird fiction, which at the time, the genres weren't so distinct. Like Robert Howard, a lot of the stuff he wrote would have been, like weird fiction. It wasn't, as we know it now, stuff like Sword and Sandal. But Lovecraft, he had a correspondence with many other writers at the time, and a lot of what he wrote during his life didn't have the appeal that it does now. At a lot of points in his life, he consisted on tens of beings.
I really look forward to whenever we get around to doing a Lovecraft episode. He had a pretty interesting life, and a lot of the stuff that went on with him reminds me a lot of modern day with all the writing circles he was in with the UAPA and stuff. It's very reminiscent of the way writing circles will get together on message boards these days.
Well, and even some of his more popular stuff, like Dr. Herbert West, The Reanimator, he found that tale distasteful. He wrote it for a paycheck, literally. He wrote it to get paid. He thought it was, kind of grotesque, pulpier, more pulpy than what he wanted to write. And if you've read a lot of Lovecraft, you can tell the tone in Reanimator is very different from some of his other works. Things like The Thing in the Moonlight, or Call of Cthulhu, Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth.
Yeah.
He in particular, though, his writing was heavily influenced, what I talked about earlier, immigration. It's another episode to really deep dive into this, but his thoughts at the time were pretty commonplace, but xenophobia and immigration and, the fear of cultural homogenization was a major theme in some of his stories. He didn't write about it too much in his stories, thankfully. But the things, a lot of the things he wrote can be easily interpreted as allegories for the fear of the unknown. And H.P. Lovecraft, as he said, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And what he was writing at the time was kind of a new thing. He wrote about a lot of things that were outside the boundaries of human knowledge or human ability to comprehend or mentally withstand. It was a kind of a turning point in horror literature where it was branching out from things like vampires and ghosts and werewolves and murderers, a lot of horror writers were starting to evolve into these more esoteric ideas of what was scary, what elicited fear, and the descriptors they used.
Yeah. I think that's really the point where you hit like modern horror, where it's not just repackaging the real world or superstitions, although certainly there's reflections of the real world always, but you start getting into the point where people understand horror and the genre enough that they're branching into all these new ways to horrify people. You know, where at the same time as H.P. Lovecraft, you have H.G. Wells, and he's doing stuff like The Time Machine and The Invisible Man. And
The Time Machine is a good example. A large portion of that story, is questioning the frailty of the events around us. It's a very philosophical in a way. You had in 1892, you had The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilman.
have you read that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I actually really like that story.
Yeah, me too.
My initial introduction to Poe was actually in a short story collection that had The Yellow Wallpaper in it. When I initially read The Yellow Wallpaper, I just thought it was like a creepy story. The Yellow Wallpaper itself was very much about someone's mental state. And that was something that wasn't a very common structure for a horror story, but this was all about what someone went through psychologically.
Yeah, well, it's almost like a precursor to a asylum horror, because it's just this woman trapped in this room and has nothing to distract her, and so the longer she's in this room, she's just unhinging more and more and starts hyper-focusing on the fact that there's bars in the window and teeth mark on the bed and how hooks hang from the wall. The
pattern in the wallpaper.
Yeah. And then she starts thinking there's somebody in the wallpaper. Then wait, what if it's me that's in the wallpaper?
Yes, and, it concludes with her basically walking over her husband, talking about how she's finally freed the woman behind the wallpaper. It was a different kind of story for its time, and I think, as time went on, those kind of themes get expanded on more and more, but for its time, it was a pretty fresh concept. Mm-hmm. That brings us 1897, where we have Dracula by Bram Stoker.
Right, and I'll confess I actually didn't know a whole lot about Bram Stoker before I started researching for this. Who he is doesn't really matter so much for the topic of this episode as much as just that he made Dracula, which is basically what inspires everyone's image of a vampire in modern days. He was actually interesting. I found stuff that said that he was actually friends with a nephew of Polidori who wrote The Vampire. Dracula was actually also just titled The Undead up until the last minute.
That makes sense. The first thing I ever read by Stoker was after I saw The Lair of the White Worm. I'd hopped on the internet because I wanted to know some stuff. And this was, the late 90s, so I was lucky enough to have the tools to go like, oh, hey, here's something I've never been exposed to before. Let me deep dive into it. And I'd heard the name Bram Stoker because of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the film, and I ended up trying to read Lair of the White Worm. I ended up finding some articles online that told you what parts to read and what parts not to read. And so I did that. And that was actually my initial exposure to reading something that Bram Stoker had wrote. But, to speak to what you were saying about modern concept of a vampire, that's really the first time we have kind of this major supernatural ideal for what created the vampire and the sexuality behind a vampire. And, of course, we got introduced to Abraham von Helsing, a character that has, especially in the modern day, grossly outgrown his appearance as a character in a novel.
I do know when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, just before it published, in order to make sure that he hung on to the theatrical rights for it, he made sure to have a semi-dramatized reading on stage, because Bram Stoker worked as a financial manager at a theater house and personal assistant to actor Henry Irving.
But all he's known for today is being a horror writer.
Yeah. I know Henry Irving. I guess he acted a lot of Shakespeare, and I read stuff that said that when he was there for that live reading of Dracula before it was published, and that he walked out and called it dreadful. A few years after that, 1909, you'd have The Phantom of the Opera done by Gaston Leroux, which I'm only mentioning it here just because Dracula and the Phantom, at this point we're getting into all the things that were coming out at the turn of the century, which in another 20 years would start to form some of the early cinema of horror.
Well, and this time too, we, with the Phantom of the Opera and with Dracula, for example, we start having a lot of these throwbacks to Gothic horror.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Dracula in particular, we have this exotic setting with the castles and these the supernatural cloistered people, or superstitious rather, and it just kind of evolves from there. But it evoked a lot of the imagery that was prevalent in Gothic horror.
Yeah, Gothic horror, obviously not any of these things that we say come and go. Where they're coming and going is always changing. Whenever Gothic horror fades somewhere, it's still big somewhere else, and then as it fades from there, it'll be big somewhere else. And Gothic horror did have several different waves of popularity that came as different novels came out. Certainly you have another one around this time. And then I think maybe one of the last things I might want to mention is in Lovecraft's time, 1923, Weird Tales began being published, which was the first serialized magazine specifically dedicated to these sorts of horror stories. So at that point, horror's moved on from the penny dreadfuls and the novels into magazine periodicals. Now you're just at the point where there's magazines specifically dedicated to horror. And of course, this is what would sort of set the precedent for what we'd have later with radio drama horror.
You were talking about, a lot of the early work by Lovecraft is in there, Clark Ashton Smith. Then you started having some of these people, like you were referring to earlier, this kind of group that, at least through letters associated with Lovecraft, like Robert E. Howard. A lot of his Conan the Barbarian stories were in the Weird Tales magazines. These other writers gravitated towards the stories and settings and structure that Lovecraft was using, and Lovecraft himself ate off of some other writers that he associated with, and they started having very similar concentrated stories. It was kind of maybe the first example of an amalgamated universe. And the connections are all very tenuous, but it is kind of a birth of the collaborative horror, as it were.
Yeah, the way horror develops is always really interesting. A lot of the things that became core were unpopular in their own time, and I mean that goes all the way back to even Shakespeare. Once he died, of course he was famous in his time, but he started to fade for a while until he got really big in France a couple decades later, and then the way they hailed him sort of caused him to have a resurgence of popularity in England. Poe was similar, where he did okay in America, but his stuff got really popular in Europe, and then that came back. And Lovecraft was the same way, where after he died, friends of his got together all of his stories and published them in hardback for the first time together, and those became really popular in Europe, and then eventually that came back to him being popular in America.
Weird Tales, would even eventually get people such as Ray Bradbury, would find their footing in these types of circulars.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's about all I could say about Weird Tales, unless we wanted to really go off the deep end.
Well, Weird Tales probably deserves its own episode at some point as well. Yeah, at this point, we're pretty much caught up into the 1920s. I made a point of not mentioning anything about early cinema development, just because that'll probably be what we'll be starting with on next episode, where we actually get into the cinema of horror. We'll see how far we get. I'm hoping we can actually just focus more on the early days, but maybe sort of just give a quick overview of everything to get us up to where we are now. Been the history of horror in literature and theater. If you feel like we've forgotten something, or you'd like to point something out, or if you just want to give us any suggestions about what you think our next episodes after the history of horror are, by all means, let us know. And thank you for listening to Here's the Horror. And wherever you're listening to us, be it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, wherever it is, please keep in mind to subscribe and leave a review for us. Every little bit helps to help other people find the horror. And we're always trying to grow and expand our audience. And of course, you can help to make the world a little more horrifying by subscribing to us on Patreon, where you can gain access to bonus content and directly support the podcast.
You can also follow at Here's the Horror on Twitter, Here's the Horror on Instagram, and join or like us on Facebook at facebook.com Here's the Horror for additional content and to help support us.
You can also find us at here'sthehorror.com, where you can find all of our episodes, show notes, and more. And you can email any questions, comments, or suggestions to us at here'sthehorror@gmail.com. The opening song is Nightmare Machine by Kevin MacLeod. The interstitial songs are Supernatural Radio by Kevin MacLeod, The Visitor by Shane Ivers, and Engulfed by the Night by Darren Curtis. The closing song is Dealing with the Devil by Darren Curtis.
As always, this has been Daniel.
And Adam.
And until next time, stay horrified. I didn't hear me like the last 10, 15 seconds of what you said.
That's fine. I kind of didn't like what I said. I was trying to think of a way to bridge, but I guess I'm just going to give up.
What's the word I'm looking for, Adam?